Steven Pinker once said that music is auditory cheesecake. So that quote in part inspired the title of my talk for today, but I'd like to take it one step further and say that music can actually be better for you than sex and cheesecake. So this might sound like a very grand statement, but for one thing, I think it's probably more socially acceptable to perform music in large public groups than mass eating cheesecake. I don't know what you're thinking about. Jokes aside, I've wondered how I would consider myself a pioneer. After all, this instrument that I'm currently holding has been relatively unchanged in its design for the past 300 years, and the excerpt that I just played for you was written in the 1800s. Nevertheless, my current area of interest, this interface between music and psychology, is a relatively new field of research. But even Kant and Aristotle and Darwin were asking questions in their day about the role of music in our history. So in today's world, governed by statistics and polls and Google and Instagram and Facebook, where does music fit in? The answer to that question is something that I've come to realize not through my journey with music, but actually my journey through science and psychology. So, sex and cheesecake. These are two things that are both beneficial for our social interactions and personally enjoyable. But what was just happening in my brain as I was playing for you there? Well, first of all, my pupils dilated, my heart rate went up, and adrenaline started coursing through my veins. But on top of that, there's a neurochemical called dopamine that was released in my brain. And now, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's responsible for our subjective feelings of pleasure. So the areas in your brain that are activated and release dopamine, this occurs when you listen to music that you enjoy, or eat cheesecake or chocolate, or have sex, or get runner's high, or that euphoria from cocaine. Not that I'm expecting many of you to know what that feels like, but anyway. And so researchers at McGill have even discovered that there are two separate regions of the brain that respond to, one, the peak experience of pleasure when you're listening to a favorite passage of music, and the other in the few seconds leading up to that in anticipation of that climactic moment. So this suggests that probably the reason why we find listening to our favorite tunes over and over again so appealing is this emotional catharsis, or this release of tension that we experience. Now, last summer, I worked with Dr. Hans Dringenberg here at Queen's investigating neuroplasticity. And this is the idea that the brain has the capacity to change itself. Now, younger brains are more plastic than mature ones. And this is why it's easier to learn a new language or pick up a musical instrument when you're a child or teenager. And so, studies with brain imaging have found that professional musicians have more symmetrical brains than non-musicians, as well as having relatively larger areas that are responsible for things like motor control, auditory processing, and spatial coordination. So this makes a bit of sense, but then you might wonder, well, which came first? Did the people who inherently have these larger brain areas more likely to become good musicians? Well, as it turns out, however, a study in 2001 found that both in pianists and string players, both male and female musicians had a relatively larger corpus callosum, which is the bundle of fibers that connects the two halves of your brain. And so the anterior section here in the front of the brain, of the corpus callosum, was larger in musicians than non-musicians. So the brain is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger and more efficient it gets. And after learning and consolidating new information, the connections between your neurons is strengthened. And you also develop more myelin, which is the fatty tissue or the white matter that allows for more efficient transmission of the electrochemical signals in your brain. But not only is the brain plastic, but we can manipulate this plasticity using various different ways. And the research is now showing that dopamine can enhance plasticity in the auditory cortex. So in other words, the neurochemical that's responsible for feelings of pleasure can actually help your brain learn. Well, this is all well and fine, but it's getting kind of lonely up here. What if I got someone to join me? Anyone play the cello here? Oh, hey, come on up. It'll do. Ladies and gentlemen, Cameron Nishi. So, what was going on in our brains as we were both playing up here together? Because if you might have noticed that the main melody was being passed and forth between us, almost as if we're playing a game. And Cameron and I have been playing duos together since first year. And every time we do, there's a hormone called oxytocin that gets released in our bodies. Known colloquially as the love hormone, oxytocin is responsible for mediating effects such as developing trust and reducing fear, which ultimately helps with our social bonding. And it's also known to increase its levels in the bloodstream after sex. So recently, a link has emerged between the release of oxytocin and group music making, in particular group singing and group playing. But why would something like this evolve? Well, the current theory is that our prehistoric ancestors who engaged in group singing were more likely to strengthen the synchrony of the ensemble. And as a result, this group cohesion that was in preparation for activities such as hunting and warfare led them to be more successful in these activities. So they're more likely to survive and therefore pass on these behaviors and the genes that encoded for their underlying biochemical processes to their offspring. So now you have sex and cheesecake, dopamine and oxytocin. But there's still one more piece left in this puzzle that I have to share with you today that is very near and dear to my heart. What happens after you've learned in childhood and bonded in adulthood? I played that piece for my grandmother's funeral in 2008. She passed away after a lengthy downward spiral with Alzheimer's disease. And in the few months before she passed away, she fell into a coma and was hospitalized. And during this time, many of her family members came to visit her and spent hours by her bedside talking to her. But she never responded, and ultimately she never woke up. So then I had this idea of putting in a stereo system by her bedside and playing recordings of my sister and I playing violin. And then something incredible happened. She stirred. There was the barest fluttering of her eyelids, and she opened her mouth almost as if to speak. She never responded, and she never woke up. She never woke up, but she did respond. So what was happening in my grandmother's brain as she was listening to that music? This eventually became the next step in my journey with music and neuroscience. And in the music cognition lab run here by Dr. Lola Cuddy, my project has been focusing on autobiographical memories, specifically those that have been evoked by music, and how these are affected in patients with Alzheimer's disease. Now, studies with dementia patients have shown that they can still respond emotionally to familiar music, and that they also retain better mental focus after being exposed to that. Now, this is due to the fundamental evocative nature of music, because it has the ability to elicit memories that were formed earlier before the onset of either amnesia, memory loss, or dementia. And we also know that memories that have an emotional valence, that are happy or sad or angry or fearful, are much more likely to be retained over time. So this is probably what was happening with my grandmother, because even though she couldn't remember what day it was or where she was even, she could still remember music, probably after listening to my sister and I practicing at home for the last 20 years. And on top of that, there is a theory called cognitive reserve. So in a disease like Alzheimer's, which is considered neurodegenerative in that the white matter is destroyed over time, the theory is that if you build up more intraneural connections earlier on, before something like this happens, then you build up a reserve of information storage, and that even once the neural deterioration starts, you'll still be able to retain a relatively larger mass of neural connections and therefore retain better functioning. So everything is interconnected. By improving the richness of your experiences by, say, listening to music, you can strengthen your brain and the synaptic connections, and also make your memories more durable. They say that music is a secondary adaptation for our species, but I would have to argue that today, more than ever, it is playing a critical role in our society and our existence. Back when the pieces that I've performed for you today were written, syphilis and tuberculosis were decimating the European Romantics. But today, global rates of mental illness and dementia and autistic spectrum disorder are skyrocketing. Music may not have the immediate potency of an antibiotic to cure people's bodies, but I do believe that it has the ability to help brains heal and adapt. Music is more than just a form of communication and creative expression. The science shows that there are actual physiological benefits that are immeasurable. In short, music enables plasticity, the ability to learn, grow, change, adapt to new knowledge and skills. And it also facilitates team building, because working in concert with other people has proven to be not only a strength, but a necessity of our species. And lastly, music aids memory in ways that are clearly deep-rooted, although we've barely begun to understand their full implications and their complexity. And if you think about those three things, in particular adaptability and team building, those are qualities that are becoming increasingly sought after in an ultra-competitive workforce and even in academic institutions. And I believe that music has the capacity to teach these qualities on a large-scale basis. In a tough economic climate like the one that we've been facing in recent years, music may not be the first thing that goes, but it's certainly not the last thing that stays. I'm challenging you here and today to change that fact. I'm challenging each and every one of you who is watching and listening here today to go out and seek music, whether it's a concert, a performance, a coffee house, or finding that old instrument up in your attic, or jamming with your friends, whatever the case may be. To seek out performance and find out for yourself how music can change your brain and ultimately change you. But let's be honest, the best part about music, just like sex and cheesecake, is that it's fun.